What's up, guys? It's Carrington, and today we're going over Gavin Ortlund's Why Full-Preterism is the Worst End Times View. Now, full transparency, this is not going to be a full reaction video. I do not have the amount of time for the amount this brother unfortunately yaps a lot. So we're just going to go into the specific points that he points out on why full-preterism is wrong, and then we're going to respond to that.
Evils for partial preterism. Why is that a reasonable view? Why might some Christians hold that, even if you don't agree personally? Try to understand it. And then third, I'll give an argument against full preterism, and say a little bit about why this view is so problematic. So first, let's just distinguish between full preterism and partial preterism. Sometimes these are called, partial preterism, sometimes it's called moderate preterism or orthodox preterism. Full preterism is sometimes called consistent preterism, hyper preterism, radical preterism. All these terms are disputed in the debates. Full preterists believe, try to wrap your head around this, all the eschatological events of the New Testament were fulfilled in the first century. We are currently living in the new heavens and on the new earth. Jesus' second coming was not a bodily event at the end of history. It was a spiritual return, manifested in judgment on Jerusalem in 70 AD especially, and the final resurrection took place spiritually toward the latter portion of the first century. And this...
Okay, so we have to go back and address each point that he just made there.
In the first century. We are currently living around this. Radical preterism, all these terms are disputed in the debates. Full preterists believe, try to wrap your head around this, all the eschatological events of the New Testament were fulfilled in the first century.
Yes, Gavin, we do believe that all the eschatological prophecies, or all the entire prophecies of the Bible to begin with, are fulfilled, because Jesus himself said that all the prophecies would be fulfilled when they, not us, saw Jerusalem surrounded by the Gentile armies, as said in Luke 21. So that's not something far off to say. You guys have to define what all things written mean in Luke 21.
We are currently living in the new heavens and on the new earth. Jesus' second coming was not a bodily event at the end of history. It was a spiritual return, manifested in judgment on Jerusalem in 78.
Okay, this is a straw man argument, because he's, by classifying it as just a spiritual return, he's completely disregarding what actually happened in that first century. It's not just about the time where the actual temple was destroyed in 70 AD. Parousia denotes a long-term extended stay. And we know from history, thanks to historians like Josephus, Tacitus, to writings like Sefer Yosipon or Hegesippus, that there were actual supernatural events that happened and occurred leading up to that destruction. Starting in 66 AD, there were chariots and armies of fire seen in the clouds. There was a sword-shaped star seen hovering over the temple. There was a figure, a face seen in the sky by Yosipon and Hegesippus, which, again, all of these people recognize and see that this happened. Eusebius also mentioned a phantom seen in the sky. So it's not just a spiritual coming, oh, Jesus just came spiritually. Like, no, there was actual signs. People actually saw the signs, and they knew what time it was when they were living in it. And that's why Josephus identified the times that he was living in as the revolution of the ages, which is exactly what Jesus is talking about when he talks about the end of the age, which you'll see later down in the line. He'll admit that the Great Tribulation has happened, but if the end of the age and the Great Tribulation has happened, according to Daniel 12, that means the resurrection of the dead has already happened. And you will see the inconsistencies of partial preterism just completely deteriorate the ground upon which they stand.
AD especially, and the final resurrection took place spiritually toward the latter portion of the first century. And this would be basically, I think we can safely say this is a first-rank issue. This would be heretical. You cannot affirm the Apostles' Creed, that Christ will come to judge the quick and the dead. And I think there are two reasons why I would
Notice how they always go to the creeds and to the history. If a Protestant, in this case, quotes to you history, creeds, and all of this in a refutation of full preterism, as a Protestant who believes in sola scriptura, then that shows you that you're already winning. Because if they actually had a solid biblical reason, then they would show you straight from the text. This is what separates the 70 AD fulfillment from a future 2,000 plus years ongoing fulfillment. And you will see nowhere in this video does Gavin do anything of the sort.
Classify this as a first-rank issue, that is to say heretical, that is to say outside of Christian orthodoxy, that is to say not Christian. One is the way Paul classifies Hymenaeus and Philetus in 2 Timothy 2. Okay, this is a view people were saying at that time as well. And he says they have swerved from the truth.
Again, this is the same washed up argumentation that any preterist hears. It's actually self-refuting, because Hymenaeus and Philetus, if what they were believing the resurrection to be was what Gavin believed the resurrection to be, which was a physical bodies raising out of graves and out of tombs at the end of history, which again, by the way, the Bible never mentions an end of history ever. So that's a presupposition. But if Hymenaeus and Philetus had this idea of resurrection that Gavin and all these futurists have of bodies raising out of the grounds, and couldn't anyone just go to Hymenaeus and Philetus at the time when Paul was writing this and say, hey, look at the tombs, look at the cemeteries. Obviously, there are no bodies raising out of the grounds, so the resurrection couldn't have already happened. So that shows you that the resurrection that Hymenaeus and Philetus were saying has already happened was not the resurrection that futurists attribute in their minds. And that also just completely refutes their point as well, because this was written before the temple fell. And again, Jesus Christ connected all of the things that the Old Testament predicted, namely Daniel 12, to happen when they, his disciples, would have seen Jerusalem surrounded by the Gentile army. It makes this argumentation is washed up. It's really washed up, and you'll see that he really doesn't have that many arguments against full preterism at all. It's the same washed up stuff that we hear every singular day.
Saying that the resurrection has already happened. This tells you categorically what kind of error this would be.
I'm going to fast forward.
The way Paul classifies a rejection of the bodily resurrection, or differing.
I'm going to fast forward to a chart that he, as a partial preterist, asserts separates what happened in 70 AD and what happens in the future. Now, as you guys can see here, he says partial preterism believes that the Great Tribulation has already occurred, and that future is the final resurrection, the final judgment. But I'm going to read to you guys a passage in Daniel, and we will see how cognitively dissonant this chart is. At the time, this is again at the time of the end, at the time Michael the archangel, who stands guard over your nation, will arise. Then there will be a time of anguish greater than any since nations first came into existence. This is exactly the great tribulation that Jesus was talking about. But look, continue reading. But at that time, every one of your people whose name is written in the book will be rescued, and many of those bodies lie dead and buried will rise up, some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting disgrace. So Daniel 12 just shows you that the great tribulation that they want to put in the past is connected with the resurrection of the dead. And that's exactly what Jesus himself says on Mount Olivet. This is the problem with futurism. This is the problem with partial preterism. This is the problem with the historical church's interpretation of eschatology, is that it typifies the destruction of the temple to mean something that is a type and shadow of the true, real fulfillment. This is a categorical error, because the moment Jesus Christ is on the scene, we're out of the types and shadows. We're in the real. The types and shadows of the destruction of the temple was the first destruction of the temple when the priest came to examine the temple first. That was the type. And so to typify the destruction to mean there is a physical destruction of the world is to misunderstand Hebraic apocalyptic language, and it is completely to just divorce the Bible of its context. And so, does this chart even make sense if you understand your Bible?
Events. So those are the things you can see in the past, but in the future, the major eschatological events, the four big ones, are still future: the second coming, final resurrection, final judgment, and the final state, the inauguration.
Yeah, and again, Isaiah, when he's talking about the new heavens and new earth, this is again all at the time the Messiah comes down in history. This is a one-time occurring in history. This isn't something separated by thousands and thousands of years. I'm going to fast forward because I actually have to wrap up. He goes into an appeal for partial preterism, but his appeal, again, completely does not address the drastic contradiction that I just pointed out right now. I'm just going to go in briefly into his appeals against full preterism, and then we're going to wrap this thing up.
Seriously. However, here is what happens. Third section of the video. Once you start to get the appeal for partial preterism, some people switch over all the way into full preterism, and they think, well, then everything happened then. And this is very tricky. Though the issue here is that this preterist hermeneutic has a lot of explanatory power. Basically, what you're saying is you're trying to take the timetables at face value, as well as the general sense of imminence throughout the New Testament. Once you're able to embrace this, you see how powerful it feels. basically when Jesus said, I'm coming soon, he meant soon. He didn't mean 2 millennia, and you have to interpret the word soon really weird. When he said before this generation passes away, he meant before this generation passes away. So the power of this hermeneutic is you're just trying to honor the timetables. And so the appeal becomes, don't project an interpretation back onto these words. It would have been...
Look where he's about to go with this. I'm going to fast forward because, again, he talks a little bit too much and time is running.
I'll just quote J. Stuart Russell. His book was very well-known leading theologian, kind of the same way. I read it before reading the Parousia. I hope better scholars than I will continue to handle. One of these is something Christians can disagree on. Set boundaries for whether you're within the faith. But let me now show why I think full preterism ultimately just doesn't work. And I think there are a lot of reasons that we can make, but let me just appeal to the very one we've already identified. This common sense hermeneutics. Because here's the irony of full preterism. The whole appeal is, hey, let's take the timetable references at face value. Let's take this as the original hearers would have taken them. Now, we can take that very appeal and apply it to full preterism as well. Because when you get to the resurrection, the rapture, and the millennium, full preterists lapse into the same kind of excessive qualifying and hair-splitting and tortured exegesis that they decry in the futurists. Okay, they're the ones going against common sense hermeneutics on these topics. For example, Revelation 20. Revelation 20, the millennium, this is a passage Russell...
By the way, this is his only example that he gives.
I admire his honesty in kind of putting out that. If I recall, he actually abandoned a total preterism on this text. But contemporary full preterists usually go basically about Revelation 20. They have to identify with something in the past. Sometimes it'll be the period between Christ's ministry and the fall of the temple, 40 years.
Blah, 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 blah. He talks about the potential full preterist. He's about the millennium.
The whole power of preterist hermeneutics, which is heed the timetables, take them at face value, take them as they would have been taken by the original hearers. Can you imagine any reader of John's Apocalypse, the book of Revelation, hearing 1,000 years and then thinking it's actually 3 or 40 or 62? The number 1,000 years can be literal or symbolic. That's a legitimate discussion. But it always refers to a long period of time in the scripture. And to think of, especially when you add on the cataclysmic war with Satan depicted at the end of the millennium, it's like, where are you going to put that into 132 AD or something like this? So what I'm trying to show here is the preterist appeal to timetables and to a common sense hermeneutic is inconsistent. It only looks at the short timetables, not the long timetables. This is why Revelation 20 is such a significant text in our Bibles. Because here you have this 1,000 years, what do we do with that? I like how Keith Matheson puts this in his really helpful book, Responding to Full Preterism. Quote, hyper-preterists continually argue that a generation cannot be stretched to 2,000 years or more. And yet, they take the 1,000 years of Revelation 20 and compress it into a generation.
Okay, so that's pretty much the crux of his argument against full preterism. Full preterism believes in a common sense hermeneutic. We believe in honoring audience relevancy. We want to read the text as though they would have read it in the first century. And so he picks up a very specific detail in the book of Revelation and says, well, they don't believe in the literal version of this, so that how can their hermeneutic be right? Number one, there's many different interpretations of the millennium. If you divorce the context and the genre of the book of Revelation being apocalyptic, and you make it prose, you make it literal instead of poetry, you're going to grasp at straws at these little details. Like, for instance, locusts with men's faces. Are we to be really looking for locusts with men's faces? No, it's an imagery book. That is the entire point of it. And when it talks about the cataclysmic war going on and all of that, I mean, Jesus himself said that the strong man was bound in his earthly ministry. So that wasn't something that was waiting to have happened. Essentially what happened is John was looking into the spiritual world. He was seeing a vision of what had happened in the spiritual reality. That doesn't mean it was yet to come again. Jesus himself said that Satan was bound in his earthly ministry. This, full preterism appeals to common sense hermeneutic, but they fail at this millennial reign thing. It doesn't really work. And the reason why this doesn't work, in the beginning and in the end of the book of Revelation, are time warnings, are time statements given about soon. This will happen soon. Do not seal up the words of prophecy, for the time is coming soon, which is in stark contrast compared to the words that God gave Daniel when his prophecy, when the words that God gave Daniel were not to come till about 500 plus years after and later, God told Daniel to seal up the words of prophecy, for the time wasn't coming soon. It's been 2,000 plus years. Jesus told John not to seal up the words of prophecy, for the time is at hand. So please tell me how 500 plus years equates to sealing up the words of prophecy, but 2,000 plus years ongoing into the future equates to not sealing up the words of prophecy? That makes no sense if we're doing this common sense hermeneutic that he wants to use against full preterism. And again, remember, the end of the book of Revelation says that all of these things would be happening soon. not to seal up the word, the end of it, meaning that the entire culmination, the entire climax of the book of Revelation was to happen then. And this is where, unfortunately, futurists like my brother Gavin fail in debunking full-preterism. He didn't answer any of what full-preterists have to say. He didn't even go into explain the ontological definition of death from the garden, meaning the separation of man from God's presence, which is what brought physical death into the picture to begin with. The tree of life was in God's presence. They had to be exiled out of God's presence so that they might not take from the tree of life and eat forever, meaning they were made mortal, meaning that our purpose solely is to be in the presence of God, and that is how we achieve eternal life. Love the brother, but unfortunately, he didn't have much to say regarding full-preterism, and he didn't debunk it. So, guys, like the video and subscribe. We're going to do more videos like this as things like this come into the full-preterist court as a full-preterist.